Why hello everyone, and welcome back to Background Historian. Tonight we are exploring one of the most prominent empires in the last millennia. Nowadays, people laugh at the beans on toast breakfast, but the British Empire was one of the most feared, respected, and prosperous empires in recent memory. Sit back, maybe with some beans on toast, and enjoy this soothing recollection of the life of the British Empire throughout history. Cheers! Part 1: The Island That Looked Outward. The wind rolls gently over the cliffs of Dover, brushing against blades of green grass and stone-grey skies. If you were to stand there, centuries ago, you'd be standing on an island that, at the time, seemed a world apart. Small, fractured, ruled by kings and queens whose power barely extended beyond their borders. And yet, from this isolated place, an empire would one day stretch across a quarter of the world. The story of the British Empire doesn't begin with conquest. It begins with curiosity. Back in the late 1400s and early 1500s, Britain was not yet the sea power we remember it to be. Spain and Portugal dominated the oceans, sending fleets to the New World and returning with ships heavy with gold and silver. Britain watched and learned. And eventually, Britain built. By the 16th century, under Queen Elizabeth I, England had found its sea legs. Figures like Sir Francis Drake, a pirate to the Spanish and a hero to the English, began to test the limits of maritime ambition. They raided ships, claimed islands, and set the tone for a nation that would soon look outward not just with curiosity, but with hunger. You see, the early empire wasn't about administration or bureaucracy. It was about opportunity. Gold, spices, sugar, land. And with those, came something darker: slavery, violence, domination. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's slow down, take a breath, and begin at the beginning. Part 2: The Seeds of Empire, North America, India, and the West Indies. The 1600s were not a quiet century. Europe was ablaze with ambition. Nations jostled for territory like players in a deadly game of chess. And England, soon to be Great Britain, stepped boldly onto the board. Let's begin with North America. North America, colonies and consequences. In 1607, British settlers founded Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in the New World. It was rough. Disease, starvation, conflict with Native Americans. And yet, it endured. Why? Because of tobacco. That cash crop became the lifeline of the colony and the first brick in Britain's colonial wall. Soon came Massachusetts, founded by Puritans seeking religious freedom, but who weren't especially tolerant themselves. The east coast of what is now the United States began to fill with British settlers, some driven by faith, others by profit, many by both. These colonies would become the training ground for the British imperial style: governors sent from the crown, trade restrictions to ensure British profit, and an economy increasingly dependent on enslaved labor, particularly in the southern colonies and the Caribbean. The West Indies, sugar and slavery. In the Caribbean, Britain's presence grew rapidly. By the mid-1600s, it had taken Barbados, Jamaica, and other islands from the Spanish and Dutch. What was the draw? One word: sugar. Sweet, white gold. But sugarcane didn't grow itself. And so began one of the darkest chapters of empire, the Atlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, and transported in brutal conditions across the ocean only to be forced into back-breaking labor on British plantations. The wealth poured into London and Bristol. Families in England grew rich. But it came at a cost beyond measure. It's here we pause. Because while the empire expanded its reach, it also expanded its shadow. The British Empire wasn't just ports and flags and trade. It was exploitation. It was dominance. It was cruelty dressed in fine silks and naval uniforms. India, trade before rule. While Britain was planting its flag in the Americas and the Caribbean, something quieter, but far more enduring, was beginning in the East. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to the East India Company, a group of merchants looking to trade in spices, silks, and tea. They weren't looking to rule India. Not yet. But oh, they would. The company set up trading posts in places like Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. They struck deals with local rulers, formed alliances, and slowly embedded themselves in the politics of the subcontinent. And as Mughal power waned, the British found an opening, a slow seep of influence, like ink into water. By the end of the 17th century, Britain had carved out colonies on 3 continents. Its navy was growing. Its merchants were rich. Its flag flew in more and more corners of the world. But it was still just the beginning. Because in the next century, the British Empire would face revolutions, wars, and its own transformation from a scattered collection of trade posts to a global superpower. But before we march into that storm, let's take a breath. You can almost hear the clink of teacups in London parlours. The pages of parliamentary debates turning. The tide is about to rise. Part 3: War, Rebellion, and the Empire that fought itself. We now step into the 18th century, a time when the British Empire found itself balancing on the edge of greatness and unraveling all at once. This is the century of red coats and revolution, of tea chests tossed into harbours, and of thrones lost and gained on battlefields far from home. It's a story of empire becoming, but also breaking. Let's begin with one of the loudest cracks. The American Revolution, the empire splits. By the mid-1700s, Britain's North American colonies were flourishing. 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast, bustling with trade, farmland, and towns that began to feel less like outposts and more like homes. But something had shifted. Britain saw the colonies as assets, sources of revenue, labor, and obedience. The colonists, meanwhile, began to see themselves as something else. Not fully British, but not fully separate. Caught in between. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. A global conflict between Britain, France, and others, cost the crown dearly. Britain emerged victorious, claiming vast territories including Canada. But war is never cheap. To pay the debt, Parliament began taxing the colonies. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. To London, it seemed fair. To the colonists, it seemed tyrannical. They had no voice in Parliament. No taxation without representation became more than a slogan, it became a rallying cry. By 1775, rebellion turned to revolution. Redcoats marched. Muskets fired. and in 1776 the colonies declared independence. The British Empire had its first major fracture. India, the jewel begins to shine. While Britain was losing ground in America, it was gaining something far more valuable: control in India. The East India Company, that trading venture born in the days of Queen Elizabeth, had become a force of its own. It had its own private army, its own taxes, its own governors. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the company gained control of Bengal, a rich region in eastern India. From there, it expanded its reach, slowly, then quickly, through alliances, wars, and economic dominance. This wasn't a traditional empire, yet. But it was something new: corporate colonialism. By the end of the 1700s, British rule in India was deeply entrenched, though not yet official. The Crown still looked the other way, for now. The Caribbean and slavery's cruel hold. In the West Indies, the plantations of Jamaica, Barbados, and others kept producing sugar, molasses, and rum, all with the forced labor of enslaved Africans. Britain's economy, its ships, banks, and cities, was inextricably tied to the transatlantic slave trade. By the late 1700s, voices began rising against it. Abolitionists in Parliament and across the country began to question the morality of slavery. Men like William Wilberforce and women like Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved man who wrote his own memoir, shook the conscience of the nation. But the system held strong, for now. Napoleon and the making of a global power. While the empire tended to its colonies, Europe was about to explode. The French Revolution had swept away kings and created chaos. Out of that chaos rose Napoleon Bonaparte, a general who would become emperor and nearly bring Europe to its knees. Britain opposed him at every turn. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, were long, bloody, and expensive. But Britain's navy dominated the seas. Admiral Nelson's victory at Trafalgar in 1805 secured that dominance, even as Nelson himself died in battle. By the time Napoleon was defeated for good in 1815 at Waterloo, the British Empire had emerged stronger than ever. France was broken. Spain and Portugal were fading. And Britain? Britain stood astride the world. Reflections at the turn of the century. By the early 1800s, the British Empire had lost America, gained Canada, India, Australia, and more, grown its navy into the most powerful fleet on Earth, become the center of a global trade network that touched every continent. But even now, as we pause and look at the empire's expanding shadow, the contradictions deepen. This was an empire of laws, yet built on injustice. An empire of commerce, yet driven by exploitation. An empire that claimed to civilize, yet often destroyed the very cultures it touched. The 19th century would bring even greater expansion. But it would also bring demands for reform, for liberty, for equality, and for the British, a choice, to change or to cling. Part 4 of the Victorian Apex, the empire on which the sun never set. The 19th century is often remembered as the high tide of the British Empire. And at the very center of this vast imperial machine stood a small, stately woman, wearing black and rarely smiling. Queen Victoria. When she took the throne in 1837, she inherited an empire already wide in scope. But by the time of her death in 1901, Britain ruled over nearly a quarter of the world's landmass and governed hundreds of millions of people. Let's walk slowly through this golden age, or perhaps, Gilded Age. Industrial power, imperial muscle. Britain's success in the 1800s wasn't just about military strength, it was about industry. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 1700s, was in full swing by the Victorian era. Coal mines hummed, factories roared, and steamships replaced sails. This explosion of production needed something vital: resources and markets. And so, the empire expanded. Iron rails were laid across colonies. Telegraph lines stitched continents together. British cotton mills churned with Indian and Egyptian fiber. Sugar from the Caribbean, tea from Ceylon, rubber from Malaya, all flowed into London, Liverpool, and Manchester. Britain was no longer just a European kingdom. It was the global factory, the bank, and the boss. India, from company to crown. Let's return to India, the so-called jewel in the crown. By the 1830s, the East India Company had near-total control over large swaths of the subcontinent. But its arrogance, corruption, and heavy-handedness stoked resentment. In 1857, that resentment erupted in the Indian Rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny. It began with soldiers in the British Indian Army, but quickly spread to civilians, princes, and peasants. It was brutal. Towns were burned. Villages razed. Rebels and innocents alike were executed. And though Britain ultimately crushed the rebellion, it changed everything. In 1858, the British government dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India. From then on, India was governed by the British Raj, with Queen Victoria declared Empress of India in 1876. She never visited Africa, the scramble for control. If India was the jewel, Africa was the next frontier. In the late 1800s, European powers began the scramble for Africa, a rush to colonize and claim territory. At the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, European nations literally drew lines on the map, dividing up the continent with rulers and pens. Britain claimed huge swaths of territory. Egypt and Sudan in the north. Kenya and Uganda in the east. South Africa in the south. Nigeria, the Gold Coast, and Sierra Leone in the west. In many cases, resistance was met with violence. Battles were fought, kingdoms dissolved. Local customs were dismissed. Languages were suppressed. And British officials, often with little understanding of the cultures they ruled, imposed systems meant to benefit Britain first. In South Africa, the British waged a bitter war, the Boer War, against Dutch settlers who had claimed the land before them. It lasted from 1899 to 1902 and included scorched earth tactics and the use of concentration camps, where thousands of civilians died from disease and starvation. All in the name of empire. The home front, empire at the dinner table. Back in Britain, most citizens never saw the colonies. But the empire was everywhere. Children studied maps of British colonies in school. Tea, sugar, and cotton, all imperial goods, sat on every breakfast table. Advertisements glorified British rule abroad. God Save the Queen was sung with pride. To many, empire meant prestige, prosperity, power. But to others, It meant cost. A moral cost. A human cost. Voices began to rise. Some protested the brutality of imperial wars. Others questioned the hypocrisy of bringing civilization to people while denying them liberty. British missionaries, writers, and reformers started to wrestle with the contradictions. A world wrapped in red. By 1900, the British Empire truly spanned the globe. Its territories included Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand, large portions of Africa, the Caribbean, Hong Kong, Malaysia, parts of the Middle East. Maps were shaded in red, and the phrase echoed across the world. The sun never sets on the British Empire. But the sun was starting to drift. Underneath the surface of strength, change was stirring. Nationalist movements. Political unrest. The rise of new global powers. And an event that would shake the world, and the empire, to its core. A war. A world war. But we'll rest before that storm. Part 5, World Wars and the Beginning of the End. The 20th century opened with grandeur. The British Empire was at its peak. Red swept across maps from Canada to New Zealand, from India to Nigeria. The Queen was gone, but her legacy, Victoria's empire, remained a source of immense pride for millions in Britain. And yet, storm clouds were forming. This part of the story is not about conquest. It's about cost. Not about expansion, but unraveling. This is the age of war, resistance, and the beginning of the empire's end. World War I, the empire bleeds. In 1914, the world spiraled into war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo lit the fuse, but what followed was far greater than a Balkan affair. The great powers of Europe, entangled in alliances, declared war. Britain joined, and the British Empire followed. It became a world war precisely because of empire. Soldiers came not just from Britain, but from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Caribbean, Africa, and Ireland. Over 2.5 million troops from the colonies fought for the empire in World War I. Many believed their loyalty would be rewarded with independence, or at least equality. But when the war ended in 1918, the empire returned to business as usual. Worse still, the aftermath saw economic hardship and growing unrest. In India, in 1919, British troops opened fire on peaceful protesters in Amritsar, killing hundreds. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre shook the conscience of the world. Mahatma Gandhi's campaign of non-violent resistance would soon follow. Between the wars, cracks in the foundation. The 1920s and 1930s were a time of contradiction. On one hand, the empire was still vast and visible. The British king was now Emperor of India. Royal visits drew crowds. Colonial exhibitions in London showcased the diversity and supposed glory of the empire. But underneath the pageantry, change was coming. Ireland fought a bitter war for independence, gaining partial freedom in 1921. India's nationalist movement grew, calling for self-rule, Swaraj. African activists, many of them educated in British schools, began to question colonial rule. In the Middle East, British mandates in Palestine and Iraq bred tension. Meanwhile, Britain itself was struggling. The economy faltered. The Great Depression hit hard. And as Europe drifted toward fascism, few realized another world war was about to arrive. World War II, empire at war again. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. Once again, the empire followed. Troops from across the Commonwealth joined the fight. India alone contributed over 2.5 million soldiers. In North Africa, the Middle East, Burma, and the Pacific, empire soldiers fought and died under the Union Jack. But something had changed. This time, many in the colonies saw the war not just as a battle for democracy, but a chance to break free. Britain, exhausted and economically drained by 1945, no longer had the power it once wielded. And the world had changed, too. Two new superpowers had emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both were suspicious of empires, especially the Americans, who began to pressure Britain to decolonize. The empire's time was ending. India, the beginning of the end. In 1947, Britain's most prized colony, India, gained independence. But the path there was not smooth. Years of protest, imprisonment, and political negotiation had brought India to the brink. Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, all shaped the struggle. And when freedom came, it came at a cost: partition. India was divided into India and Pakistan along religious lines. Violence erupted. Over 1 million people died. 15 million were displaced. It was one of the largest human migrations in history. The British flag came down. And with it, the myth of the invincible empire. One by one, other colonies began to demand, and receive, independence. The winds of change. In 1957, Ghana became the first African colony to gain independence. By the 1960s, the British Empire was disintegrating. Kenya gained independence in 1963, after a brutal uprising known as the Mau Mau Rebellion. Nigeria, Uganda, Zambia, Malawi, all followed. The Caribbean moved toward self-rule. Hong Kong would remain under British control until 1997, but its future was already being questioned. In 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan delivered a famous speech in South Africa. The wind of change is blowing through this continent. And it was not just blowing, it was howling. Reflections before the fall. As we approach the final chapter of this story, it's worth pausing here. The British Empire was more than maps and monarchs. It was an idea, one that promised glory, order, and civilization. But in practice, it was messy, violent, complex. It brought roads, railways, and law. But also war, inequality, and loss. Millions lived and died under its rule, some grateful, many resentful, most unheard. And as the sun began to set on Britain's global dominion, the nation would have to redefine itself, not as an empire, but as a nation among nations. Part 6: The Legacy of Empire, Memory, Identity, and the Post-Colonial World. As the 20th century turned its final corner and faded into the 21st, the British Empire no longer existed on paper. The red had drained from the maps. The Union Jack had been lowered in cities from Nairobi to Kingston, Delhi to Hong Kong. But empire doesn't simply vanish. It lingers, in languages, in laws, in railways, in parliaments, in paradox. This final chapter isn't about conquests or colonies. It's about memory. About what remains. And about how an empire's echo can still shape the present, long after the last trumpet has sounded. The Commonwealth, a family, or a reminder. After independence, many former colonies chose to remain linked with Britain through the Commonwealth of Nations. Originally called the British Commonwealth, it became a voluntary association of 56 countries, some republics, some monarchies, all formerly part of the empire. The Commonwealth shares ideals, democracy, human rights, development. Every 4 years, they hold the Commonwealth Games, a kind of gentler Olympics. But this relationship is complex. To some, the Commonwealth is a symbol of continued connection. A way to foster peace, trade, and diplomacy among nations with shared histories. To others, it's a reminder of colonialism's grip. A gilded echo of empire dressed in the robes of modernity. Still, the British monarch remains head of the Commonwealth, even as countries question the meaning of that title. Windsor and the Empire's Ghost. The royal family, iconic, enduring, and increasingly scrutinized, has come to represent the empire's most visible legacy. Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned from 1952 until 2022, was not just the figurehead of Britain. For decades, she was the symbolic anchor of dozens of nations still wrestling with the meaning of their colonial past. Under her reign, countries like Barbados declared themselves republics, removing the British monarch as head of state. Others, like Australia and Jamaica, openly debated doing the same. The transition from empire to monarchy as symbol is an uneasy one. Behind palace gates and royal processions lies centuries of imperial entanglement, often unspoken, but never forgotten. Post-colonial Britain, who are we now? The British Empire shaped Britain as much as it shaped the world. Waves of migration from former colonies transformed British society, Caribbean communities in London, South Asians in Leicester and Birmingham, Africans in Manchester, Hong Kongers in Reading. British food, fashion, music, language, everything has become a mosaic of empire's legacy. And yet, empire remains a subject of discomfort. For decades, schoolbooks glossed over the horrors. The Amritsar massacre, the Mau Mau detention camps, the Bengal famine, slave plantations, these were often omitted or softened. But the tide is shifting. In recent years, movements like Rhodes Must Fall, Black Lives Matter, and campaigns for reparations have reignited public debate. Statues are questioned. Museums examine the origins of their artifacts. Universities reckon with their colonial benefactors. Britain, once proud of its empire, now stands at a crossroads. What to remember? What to honor? What to apologize for? There are no easy answers. The global legacy, shadows and light. The British Empire left behind a world reordered. English became a global language. Common law shaped legal systems in over 50 countries. Railways, postal systems, and governance structures took root in distant lands. Borders, often arbitrarily drawn, continue to spark conflict. Economic inequality rooted in colonial exploitation still persists. For some, the empire laid foundations. For others, it built cages. Countries like India, Singapore, and Kenya have risen to become regional powers, shaped by, but not defined by, their colonial pasts. Others continue to grapple with the scars left behind. And across the global south, the question remains, who benefits still from the structures empire built? A final reflection, empires are human things. Let us pause. Because behind every imperial document, every map drawn in a London office, every trade route etched into the sea, there were people. Sailors who never returned. Tribes whose names were forgotten. Clerks who signed treaties they didn't understand. Children raised to speak a language not their own. Rulers who thought they brought light, and those who resisted them in darkness. The British Empire was vast, yes. But it was never just ships and taxes and treaties. It was dreams, deaths, desires. It was brutality, and beauty, and blunder. It was, in the end, a human thing, as flawed and extraordinary as the people who made it. And so the sun set. Today, the British Empire lives only in memory, in history books, in echoes across oceans. But its fingerprints are everywhere. In the languages we speak. In the flags we raise. In the stories we tell, and those we choose to forget. Empires fall. They always do. But their shadows linger. And so we look forward, with eyes open and history in hand. Not to glorify. Not to erase. But to understand. Now, let's take a dive into fun facts revolving around the British Empire. Ease yourself to sleep while listening to some silly natures of this long-standing empire. Fun facts about the British Empire, Part 1. The empire was so vast that it covered every time zone. This led to the famous phrase, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." At its height, if it was night in London, it was likely daylight in some other part of the empire. Britain once controlled over 25% of the world's population. That's over 400 million people during its peak in the early 20th century. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India in 1876. Despite this title, she never once visited India during her long reign. The East India Company had its own army. At one point, this private trading company maintained a military force larger than Britain's official standing army. The British Empire inspired tea obsessions across continents. Tea became such a cultural staple in Britain because of imports from India and China. It was originally a luxury, but the empire made it a national ritual. Australia was used as a penal colony. Between 1788 and 1868, Britain sent over 160,000 convicts to Australia, many for crimes as petty as stealing bread. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain after the Opium Wars. Britain went to war with China to keep selling opium, a narcotic. The outcome gave Britain control over Hong Kong for 99 years. British redcoats were not always red. Although the nickname redcoats stuck, British soldiers wore a variety of uniforms depending on rank, regiment, and geography. Red was also eventually phased out because, well, it's not ideal camouflage. Canada almost became part of the United States. During the American Revolution, the US tried to invade Canada, hoping to spread rebellion. Canada said no thanks. The British Empire invented time zones. The idea of global time zones was formalized at the 1884 International Meridian Conference in Washington, D.C., where Greenwich, England, became the prime meridian, 0 degrees longitude. The British once ruled Egypt without technically owning it. Egypt was an autonomous region of the Ottoman Empire but was occupied and administered by the British from 1882 to 1956. The Boer War introduced the world's first use of concentration camps. During the war in South Africa, 1899 to 1902, Britain created camps for civilians. Thousands of women and children died due to poor conditions. The British Empire introduced cricket to over 50 countries. Once just a village pastime, cricket became the beloved national sport in India, Pakistan, Australia, and the West Indies, often even more popular than it is in Britain today. Gandhi was once a British-trained lawyer. Before becoming the leader of India's independence movement, Mahatma Gandhi studied law in London. British colonial officers often had entire clubs where locals were banned. These gentlemen's clubs were a hallmark of colonial cities, with strict dress codes, billiards, and brandy, but only for Europeans. The British Empire once leased a chunk of China for 99 years. That's how Britain ended up controlling Hong Kong from 1898 to 1997. When the lease ended, it was returned to China, prompting a massive historic transition. India contributed over 2.5 million troops during World War II. It was the largest volunteer army in history. They served in Europe, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. At one point, you could sail from Cape Town to Cairo entirely on British-controlled land. This was part of Cecil Rhodes' dream for a railway uniting Africa. It never fully materialized, but the idea remained a symbol of imperial ambition. The British Empire popularized the concept of the afternoon tea. This tradition began in the early 1840s and spread as a cultural export. Complete with cucumber sandwiches, scones, and debates over whether to put the cream or jam first. Many Caribbean islands were swapped like baseball cards. Britain once gave up Suriname to the Dutch in exchange for keeping New Amsterdam, now called New York. Winston Churchill was a child of empire, literally. He was born in 1874, when Britain ruled a quarter of the world, and he once famously said, "I have not become the King's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." English is now spoken by over 1.5 billion people worldwide, thanks largely to the spread of the British Empire, though local dialects, slang, and accents have turned it into a family of languages more than a single tongue. Singapore was a sleepy fishing village before British rule. Founded as a trading post by Sir Stamford Raffles in 1819, it became one of the most important ports in Asia. The British once tried to make cow urine a taxable commodity in colonial India. It didn't go over well. The British Empire helped shape the global postal system. The concept of universal penny postage and the creation of the penny black stamp in 1840 made mail accessible across the empire. The British had a colony in South America. It was called British Guiana, now known as Guyana, and it's the only English-speaking country on the continent today. Australia's federation was inspired in part by Canada. Both were dominions of the empire, and their shared structures of parliamentary democracy were modelled after the British system with a healthy dash of independence. London's Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851 was like the World's Fair for empire. It was designed to show off the empire's wealth and innovation, and it had 100,000 exhibits from around the world. British colonial officers often travelled with portable bathtubs, gin, and silver tea sets. There was a belief that civilization needed to follow wherever they went, including afternoon refreshments, no matter how remote the jungle. Many of today's global borders were drawn by imperial cartographers, often with little regard for local ethnic, tribal, or cultural divisions, leading to long-term tensions and conflict in parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Part 3. British coins once featured the phrase "Emperor of India." Even though the king or queen was based thousands of miles away, their title as Emperor or Empress of India appeared on currency until India's independence in 1947. The British Empire helped make tea time a global habit. Tea from India and Sri Lanka, then Ceylon, wasn't just for Britain. Many other colonies adopted tea drinking from their imperial rulers. Today, countries like Kenya, Pakistan, and Malaysia are all heavy tea consumers. The British once declared war on Zanzibar, and it lasted less than an hour. The Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896 is believed to be the shortest war in history, about 38 to 45 minutes long. New Zealand was the first country in the world to grant women the right to vote, in 1893. A British colony at the time, this made it a groundbreaking moment for both the empire and the world. British missionaries helped develop written alphabets for many indigenous languages. While controversial, their efforts often resulted in the first printed books in those languages, including the Bible. The British Empire introduced rugby, soccer, and cricket to dozens of countries. Some of the most passionate fans today, from India to South Africa to Australia, have Empire-era games to thank. Many famous British dishes are actually colonial hybrids. Chicken tikka masala is often cited as a national dish of Britain, even though it's an Anglo-Indian creation, believed to have been first made in Glasgow. British India once stretched from modern-day Pakistan to Burma, Myanmar. It was so large and diverse that it contained hundreds of princely states, all with their own rulers, under British advice, of course. Gibraltar is still a British territory. Situated at the tip of Spain, this tiny piece of land has been in British hands since 1713 and remains a key strategic location, even today. The Union Jack appears on several other flags. Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, and Tuvalu still include the British flag in their own designs, a visual echo of the empire. British colonies often had their own versions of the British legal system. Many former colonies still follow legal traditions based on English common law, even if they're now fully independent. The phrase "white man's burden" came from the imperial age. Popularized by Rudyard Kipling, it encapsulated the controversial idea that it was the West's duty to civilize the rest of the world, a belief now widely criticized for its racism and condescension. Railways were one of Britain's most iconic imperial exports. India's massive rail network was built during colonial rule and remains one of the largest and most heavily used systems in the world. Some British governors ruled over populations hundreds of times larger than Britain's own. The Viceroy of India governed over more than 300 million people, while Britain had fewer than 40 million at the time. Many British colonial officials never spoke the local language. Instead, they relied on translators, interpreters, and a curious blend of pidgin English to manage entire populations. Part 4. The British Empire introduced the idea of civil service exams to many of its colonies. Inspired by Chinese bureaucratic tradition, Britain formalized its own version and later exported this exam-based government hiring system across the empire, including India, where it persists today. The first postage stamp in the world was British. The famous penny black, released in 1840, featured Queen Victoria and revolutionized communication, especially across an empire where mail could travel thousands of miles by sea and rail. Mount Everest was named after a British surveyor. Sir George Everest never actually saw the mountain, but his name was chosen during British mapping of India in the 19th century. British colonizers once used quinine tonic to treat malaria, leading to the invention of the gin and tonic. The bitter quinine water was hard to swallow, so they mixed it with gin and lime. And a classic cocktail was born. British control over Palestine lasted from 1917 to 1948. Known as the British Mandate, it deeply influenced the political and cultural history of the region, laying the groundwork for future conflict and the creation of Israel. India was governed by a company before it was governed by the Crown. The East India Company ruled large parts of India with its own army and tax system before the British government took direct control in 1858. The British Empire established botanical gardens around the world. Kew Gardens in London became the model, while satellite gardens popped up in colonies like Sri Lanka, Singapore, and Jamaica to study and grow valuable crops like rubber, sugarcane, and tea. The Union Jack flag is itself a combination of other flags. It merges the flags of England, St. George's Cross, Scotland, St. Andrew's Cross, and Ireland, St. Patrick's Cross, symbolizing the union that launched imperial expansion. Many colonial officials kept pet monkeys, parrots, or even big cats. These exotic companions often served as status symbols and sources of amusement at colonial outposts. Until, of course, they trashed the teacups. The British Empire was a key force behind the global spread of Anglicanism. Missionaries and chaplains followed in the footsteps of traders and soldiers, establishing churches that remain active in countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and India. In some colonies, British sports were used to civilize the local population. Sports like cricket and football were seen as character-building tools. Ironically, many former colonies went on to dominate the British at their own games. The British Empire used census-taking as a form of control. Colonial censuses were used to classify populations by religion, ethnicity, and occupation, though often based on British assumptions rather than local realities. The largest diamond ever found, the Cullinan, was gifted to the British Crown from South Africa. Weighing over 3,000 carats, it was cut into multiple stones, including one that sits in the crown jewels. The term British Raj refers specifically to the period of direct British rule in India. This lasted from 1858 until independence in 1947, although informal economic control and influence lingered long after. British imperial rule led to the global spread of the English breakfast. With variations adapted to local tastes, full English-style breakfasts, with eggs, sausages, beans, toast, and tea, became common in places like Kenya, Australia, and Hong Kong. Part 5. British colonial schools often emphasized Shakespeare. Students in India, Nigeria, Jamaica, and beyond grew up reading Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth, sometimes before they'd ever read works in their native language. The British Empire once used seashells as money. In parts of West Africa, the British encouraged the use of cowrie shells, already used by locals, as currency, before eventually transitioning to pounds and pence. The British Empire introduced the first passports with photographs. In the early 20th century, as the empire struggled to track movement between colonies and Britain, officials began requiring identity photos, laying the groundwork for modern passports. The British Empire fueled the global spread of the metric system, kind of. Though Britain clung to imperial units, many of its colonies adopted the metric system during or after decolonization, leading to a world where Britain still buys milk by the pint, while Kenya and India don't. Many colonial towns were renamed after British royals or cities. Think of Victoria, Australia, Georgetown, Guyana, Kingston, Jamaica, or Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Even Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, was named after Cecil Rhodes. India's railways were designed to benefit Britain's economy. Tracks were laid to move goods, especially cotton and grain, to ports, not necessarily to connect Indian towns to each other. Still, they became vital to India's own development. The British Empire indirectly inspired the invention of the jockstrap. British colonizers in India and the Caribbean played cricket in very hot conditions, which necessitated support. Enter the early athletic supporter. British colonial rule in Africa often relied on indirect rule. This meant allowing local leaders to govern their own people, under British oversight, of course. It was cheaper and more orderly, though often exploited divisions. The British Empire helped spread the game of snooker. It was invented by British Army officers in India in the 19th century, as a twist on traditional billiards. The Empire once tried to ban the speaking of Irish Gaelic. During English rule in Ireland, there were efforts to suppress Irish language and culture. Gaelic-speaking schools were outlawed, and English became dominant, though Gaelic has since seen revival. British control of the Falkland Islands continues to spark tensions. Argentina still disputes Britain's sovereignty over the islands, and the 1982 Falklands War briefly reignited global attention on what remains a remote imperial remnant. The British Empire helped standardize global banking. British banks like Barclays expanded across the empire, laying the foundations for modern banking systems in dozens of countries. Many modern national flags were influenced by British naval design. Flags like Australia's and New Zealand's incorporate the Union Jack, while others borrowed the style of naval ensigns. Horizontal stripes, stars, and crosses. British colonists brought lawn tennis to India, South Africa, and Australia. What began as a garden party game in Victorian England spread across tropical outposts, leading to national tournaments that are now tennis grand slams. The empire introduced marmalade to unlikely places. British traders and civil servants took their quirky food habits abroad, including marmalade, baked beans, and pudding, often to mixed reviews. Part 6. British naval dominance was supported by the empire's global ports. With access to refueling and resupply stations in places like Gibraltar, Malta, Singapore, and Cape Town, the Royal Navy could sail almost anywhere in the world without needing to return home. The British Empire brought the English language to over 50 countries. Today, it's the official or de facto language in many former colonies, even in places where most people speak other native languages at home. Queen Victoria had Indian servants and even learned Urdu phrases. Her relationship with Abdul Karim, a young Indian attendant, scandalized her court but revealed her curiosity about the empire's diverse peoples. She even called him Munshi, or teacher. British colonization contributed to the global popularity of curry. Indian cuisine profoundly influenced British food, so much so that curry became a beloved staple in British households and pubs. The British Empire standardized weights and measures in many places. Prior to imperial rule, units of measurement varied widely between towns and tribes. The British pushed for imperial units, though some places later switched to metric after independence. The Union Jack flew over Antarctica. Britain claimed sectors of Antarctica under the British Antarctic Territory, which it still considers part of its overseas territory, though it's regulated today by international treaty. The empire created a second London on every continent. Cities like Lagos, Calcutta, Bridgetown, and Sydney were modelled with British-style town halls, cricket pitches, Anglican churches, and government offices, all symbols of imported order. British officers often kept personal diaries that shaped our view of empire. These accounts, full of adventure, tea drinking, snake encounters, and observations of local cultures, became some of the richest and most biased historical records. The British Empire inspired Victorians' curiosity cabinets. Wealthy Britons collected objects from the colonies, rare animals, tribal masks, spices, fossils, which they displayed in private homes, creating early forms of museums. In Canada, the British Empire introduced the legal system of common law. This judicial structure, based on precedent and judge-made rulings, still shapes Canadian law today. Some colonial governors ruled over territories larger than all of Britain. The Governor-General of the Sudan, for example, oversaw lands more expansive than the United Kingdom itself, often with just a few British officials in control. British colonists took the game of bridge with them. What began as a genteel parlour card game in England became widely popular in places like India, Kenya, and even remote tea plantations. The British Empire produced its own currency in colonies. From East African shillings to Indian rupees stamped with Queen Victoria's face, colonial money was minted locally but tied to British economic policy. Empire-era architecture remains iconic across the world. Colonial buildings, railway stations, law courts, and churches dot cities like Mumbai, Nairobi, and Rangoon. Many are still in use today, with a blend of British and local styles. Britain introduced driving on the left side of the road in many colonies. Today, countries like India, Australia, South Africa, and Jamaica all retain this legacy of colonial transport planning. Part 7. British colonists brought fox hunting to faraway lands. In countries like Australia and India, British settlers tried to recreate traditional English pastimes, even importing foxes and hounds to mimic the aristocratic hunt. The empire helped spread botanical knowledge through plant theft. British explorers and botanists collected, and sometimes smuggled, plants from one colony to another, helping spread crops like rubber, tea, quinine, and cacao across continents. The British Empire created one of the earliest global news networks. Using telegraph cables, steamships, and postal routes, the empire helped enable daily reporting from nearly every corner of the globe, though always from a British perspective. The British Empire introduced English-style boarding schools around the world. Modelled after Eton and Harrow, these schools trained colonial elites in English language, literature, and values, often becoming status symbols in post-colonial societies. The British Empire issued travel documents in multiple languages. British India's passports were often printed in English, Urdu, and Persian, depending on the region and time period. The empire helped popularize tropical uniforms. The iconic pith helmet, that rounded, pale sun hat, became the visual symbol of British officers in warm climates, like Africa and Southeast Asia. British officials often mapped areas they never physically visited. Much of the empire's geography was charted from afar, using local guides and long-distance surveying. Some borders were drawn with straight rulers, ignoring natural or cultural divisions. In some colonies, owning a British-made clock was a symbol of prestige. Timekeeping, punctuality, and British-manufactured goods became markers of modernity in many imperial outposts. British colonial officers were sometimes nicknamed Heaven-born. This was especially true in India, where members of the elite Indian civil service believed themselves destined to rule until independence came calling. Colonial railways were often built by local labourers under grueling conditions. While railways became key to commerce, their construction was frequently brutal, involving thousands of underpaid or conscripted workers. British imperial postcards were a thing. Travellers and colonial officials would send illustrated postcards from the far corners of the empire, showing off tropical scenes, exotic animals, and Queen Victoria's image. The empire used stamps to assert dominance. Stamps in colonial territories often bore the British monarch's portrait and were printed in England, even when mailed between two towns in Africa or the Caribbean. Some colonies printed British propaganda comics for children. These showed loyal subjects, brave explorers, and noble governors, all in bite-sized moral tales meant to reinforce imperial values. British colonization affected bird species. The introduction of new plants and animals, especially rats and cats, to places like New Zealand and island colonies contributed to the extinction of many native species. British imperial medals were handed out, a lot. From Queen's Jubilee medals to campaign ribbons, there were medals for soldiers, clerks, and governors alike, proof of service and loyalty to the crown. Part 8. British missionaries often doubled as linguists and educators. While controversial in method and motive, many missionaries created written versions of local languages and built schools, leaving linguistic legacies that still exist today. The empire introduced the game of polo to Britain via India. Though it began in Persia, polo became a popular colonial pastime after British cavalry officers in India adopted and modified the sport. Many empire-era roads followed ancient trade routes. In places like India and Egypt, the British expanded roads that had been in use for centuries, turning camel trails into carriageways and highways. British colonial troops came from across the globe. Soldiers from the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia fought in both world wars, often without equal pay or recognition, though their bravery was crucial to Allied victories. The empire minted coins with holes in the middle. In places like East Africa and Hong Kong, coins with center holes were easier to string together, ideal for hot, humid climates where pockets were less common. British administrators often kept daily ritual routines abroad. Afternoon tea, Sunday church, and cricket on the lawn weren't just customs, they were deliberate acts of bringing Britain with them, no matter the setting. A small part of France was once controlled by Britain until 1558. The town of Calais was Britain's last possession in mainland France, a reminder of its medieval ambitions long before global empire. The empire inspired uniforms in many schools still today. Neckties, blazers, pleated skirts, and school badges all trace back to British educational influence across former colonies. British settlers often changed local place names. From Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, to New South Wales, Australia, renaming was a tool of control, sometimes erasing ancient identities in the process. British colonists brought their love of gardening worldwide. From botanic gardens in Jamaica and Sri Lanka to home flower beds in Kenya and India, horticulture became a symbol of order and cultivation. The empire established censuses to monitor not just people, but animals. British officials in India and Africa sometimes counted cattle and camels to understand economies, leading to records that still help researchers today. Imperial rule created hybrid cultures and languages. From Caribbean Creole to Hinglish, Empire-era blending produced new dialects and cultural forms, some of which have taken on lives of their own. British colonization introduced Western medicine alongside folk resistance. Vaccines, hospitals, and surgeries expanded under colonial rule, but they were often met with suspicion, especially when delivered without consent or understanding. The British Empire inspired many independence movements. Ironically, by teaching law, governance, and self-determination to elites in its colonies, the empire helped foster the very movements that dismantled it. Many former colonies still drive on the left side of the road. This small but enduring habit links dozens of nations, Australia, India, Kenya, and more, to their British past with every turn of the wheel. Part 9. The British Empire popularised cricket as a colonial bonding tool. Originally a genteel sport of English country estates, cricket became a deeply embedded part of life in India, Pakistan, the West Indies, and South Africa, eventually evolving into a symbol of both unity and rebellion. Many colonial-era clubs were segregated. British officers often formed private clubs in cities like Nairobi, Delhi, and Kuala Lumpur, serving gin, billiards, and no locals allowed. Today, some of these buildings have been repurposed into hotels or community centres. The British Empire's influence helped standardise time zones. With ships, trains, and cables crisscrossing the globe, synchronised timekeeping became a necessity. The Greenwich Meridian in London was eventually chosen as the prime meridian in 1884. The British Empire used stamps to celebrate royal events around the world. Coronations, jubilees, and royal weddings were often commemorated with colourful postage stamps issued even in the tiniest colonial outposts. Colonial schools taught British history over local history. In many territories, children could name every English king, but little about their own leaders or ancestors. The British Empire built cemeteries in every corner of the globe. Soldiers, officers, missionaries, and settlers who died abroad were often buried in formal cemeteries, with gravestones and inscriptions in English, even in the middle of tropical jungles or desert plains. Colonial hotels tried to replicate English comforts. Grand hotels in Calcutta, Cairo, and Cape Town served high tea, roast beef, and claret, sometimes while surrounded by palm trees and 40-degree heat. British railcars were once shipped disassembled to colonies. Parts were manufactured in England, then shipped to be reassembled in places like India or Egypt, turning imperial engineering into something of a logistical ballet. The empire created imperial exhibitions to show off its spoils. These travelling fairs featured exotic animals, crafts, and even people, often placed in staged villages to satisfy British curiosity, a practice now criticised as exploitative and dehumanising. The empire influenced modern national anthems. Some former colonies modelled their national songs after God Save the King Queen in tone and structure. Others, like India, created distinct new musical identities post-independence. British surveyors mapped Mount Kilimanjaro and the Nile. Empire-era exploration wasn't just for science, it was tied to control. Mapping landscapes meant claiming them. The empire created new borders that didn't always work. In Africa and the Middle East especially, arbitrary lines on a map, drawn with little knowledge of local cultures, continue to shape regional tensions today. British settlers sometimes tried to plant English roses in tropical climates. The symbolism was sweet, but the result was usually wilted. Still, rose gardens became a feature in places as far off as Uganda and Malaysia. British colonial documents were copied in triplicate. Paperwork, reports, letters, all were logged, archived, and often mailed by sea to London. Today, these archives are historical treasures and mountains of bureaucracy. The British Empire left a legacy of parliamentary systems. Countries from Canada to India to Kenya still use forms of governance modelled after Westminster, with their own local adaptations, of course. Part 10. The British Empire helped establish postal systems across its colonies. In many territories, the first organised mail delivery, complete with post offices, mailboxes, and postage stamps, was introduced under British rule, helping bind vast regions together. British colonial architecture mixed styles. In India and Southeast Asia, British buildings often fused classical columns with domes and arches influenced by local styles, giving rise to Indo-Saracenic architecture. Colonial libraries carried only British literature. Works by Dickens, Austen, and Kipling filled shelves from Nairobi to Rangoon. Local authors often had to wait until independence to be published or studied widely. The British Empire contributed to the spread of Freemasonry. Masonic lodges were established in many colonies, often by British officers, creating networks of elite members tied by secret rituals and global connections. Colonial railways sometimes had segregated carriages. In parts of Africa and India, passengers were separated by race or class, a legacy of inequality that took years to dismantle. British governors often travelled with grand ceremony. Their arrivals were marked by cannon fire, parades, and formal processions, like royalty, but overseas. The empire's love of bureaucracy became legendary. There was a form for everything: land, tea exports, elephant licenses, and many are still preserved in archives today, sometimes comically overcomplicated. British settlers in cold colonies still insisted on afternoon tea. Even in chilly Canada or blustery New Zealand, scones and Earl Grey remained essential comforts. Some colonial police forces adopted British-style uniforms. Tall helmets, polished boots, and whistles became standard gear in cities far removed from London. The British Empire mapped constellations in the Southern Hemisphere. Naval officers and scientists charted unfamiliar southern skies, naming stars and creating navigational aids for global sea routes. The British exported their traditions of amateur theatre. Colonial outposts often hosted productions of Shakespeare and British comedies, complete with makeshift stages and evening gowns in the tropics. British influence led to hybrid cuisine in many regions. From Anglo-Indian dishes like mulligatawny soup to Jamaican patties with British pastry crusts, colonial kitchens created something entirely new. Colonial coinage often changed with the monarch. Every time a king or queen died, new coins were minted across the empire, sometimes before the news had reached the furthest corners. The empire led to massive botanical exchanges. Plants like tea, rubber, cotton, and sugarcane were moved between continents to fuel imperial economies, often with major ecological impacts. The British Empire remains the largest empire in history by land area. At its peak in 1920, it covered roughly 24% of the Earth's landmass and ruled over nearly 500 million people, a staggering legacy that still echoes in laws, languages, borders, and minds around the world. Those were some intriguing facts about the one and only British Empire. We will now explore a day in the life of a soldier in the British Empire's army. The quirks, the routines, and relationships that one goes through. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing and turning on that beautiful notification bell so you know when to come back for daily videos. Without further ado, follow along through the life of a typical soldier in the British Empire's army. Let your mind drift now, gently and without effort, as we walk together through the story of a man in uniform. Not just any man, but a soldier of the British Empire. His boots have touched the soils of India, the sun-baked hills of Egypt, and the green-cloaked ridges of Burma. But today, we follow him, not in battle, but in the quiet, ordinary rhythm of a day. The year is 1893. Our soldier's name is William. Corporal William Hensley. He's 32 years old, born in Yorkshire, where the morning mist clings to the moors like a woolen shawl. But here, in Madras, now Chennai, the mornings begin not with frost but with heat, and the scent of hibiscus blooming just beyond the garrison walls. He sleeps under a canvas net, his cot surrounded by the whir of insects and the slow hum of distant voices. At dawn, the bugle calls. Not sharply. Not rudely. Just enough to remind him this is a soldier's day. He rises with practiced ease, no complaints, no groaning. The stiffness in his knees is old news. His uniform is faded red, trousers tucked neatly into scuffed leather boots. He folds his bedding with care. Even in the colonies, discipline is the armor you wear before you pick up a rifle. Outside, the parade ground is already alive with movement. Rows of men, many younger than he, stand with polished bayonets and wide, blinking eyes. There are Irishmen, Scots, London lads, and colonial recruits from far-off regions. Each a thread in the Empire's tapestry. Some join for the Queen. Others for pay. Some to escape what came before. William stands tall. Not because anyone watches, but because he always does. He was once the recruit fumbling with his kit, his chin trembling from fear and sunburn. Now he helps train them. Steady hands. Quiet words. The patience of a man who's been in the dust and the rain, and knows both wash off eventually. As the officer calls the morning orders, William's mind slips for just a moment, to home. To the green hills of Yorkshire. To his sister's letter, which arrived last week, with a pressed violet still folded inside. To the heavy silence in the barracks after a patrol that didn't return whole. Then, breakfast. Nothing fancy, hardtack biscuits, black tea boiled over a crackling stove, sometimes with condensed milk if you're lucky. If the cook is in a good mood, there's dried beef, chewy and salty, that makes you thirsty all over again. They eat in silence or in laughter, depending on the news of the day. This morning, a shipment of new boots has arrived. This is big news. No one likes trench foot, even if you're not in trenches. By 7 a.m., the heat presses like a wool blanket soaked in sun. The drills begin. Marching in formation, cleaning rifles, target practice. The jungle doesn't sleep, and neither can a soldier. Yet it's not just drills and orders. William has learned the names of local boys who bring fruit to the camp. He knows the smell of tamarind, the spice of curry leaves on market wind. And sometimes, when off duty, he walks to the missionary school and teaches the alphabet to children curious about the stiff man with the wide mustache and soft eyes. You see, a soldier in the Empire is more than a man with a rifle. He's a listener, an observer, a keeper of stories he may never tell. The sun has climbed higher now, casting sharp, golden angles across the red dirt parade ground. It is mid-morning, perhaps just past 10. Time moves differently in the colonies, sometimes slow, sometimes not at all. But in the garrison, the rhythm is everything. Corporal William Hensley steps from the shade of the barracks, rifle slung over one shoulder, a half-button tunic flapping in the warm breeze. He's been assigned to a perimeter patrol, routine, but important. A simple walk around the edges of Empire. He checks his canteen. Half full. The others, 3 privates, fresh and freckled, trail behind. They don't talk much when William walks ahead. Not because he's unkind, but because he's steady. And steady earns a kind of quiet respect. They pass mango trees heavy with fruit, their broad leaves rustling like old silk. A child peers from behind a clay wall, wide-eyed, clutching a handmade toy. William smiles and tips his hat. The child disappears in a flash of giggles and dust. The patrol route winds past a trading post, busy even in the heat. Locals speak in Tamil, traders haggle in clipped English, and animals bray as they shuffle through the shade. William scans the faces, always scanning, but not in suspicion. More from habit. He has seen unrest before, in Sudan, when the heat made tempers short and decisions quicker than they ought to have been. Still, today is peaceful. The most dangerous thing he faces is the slow crack of sunburn crawling up his neck. He loosens his collar and keeps walking. At noon, they return to camp. The mess tent offers boiled vegetables and rice, a blessing on days like these. One of the privates, Jenkins, complains about the spice. William just chuckles, breaking off a piece of dry bread and dipping it in the sauce. He's learned that taste is a bridge, not a burden. And besides, it's not so bad once you get used to it. Afternoons are quieter. The officers take their tea. The barracks grow still. Outside, the air hums with cicadas and distant laughter from a village beyond the ridge. William finds a shaded spot near the munitions shed, settles down with a book, Tales of the Sea, borrowed from a crate of second-hand novels shipped from Liverpool. The spine is cracked, the page is yellowed, but it smells faintly of salt and tobacco, like home. He reads a passage about a storm at sea, but the words begin to blur. His eyes grow heavy. Not from exhaustion. Just the weight of the heat. The calm that follows duty. The kind of tired you can only feel when you've stood upright since dawn. A soft nap. Nothing long. Just enough. Later, he'll clean his boots. Maybe write a letter. The ink will blot from the sweat of his palm, but the words will still make their way to Yorkshire. He always writes simply. Weather's hot. Food's hot. Rifle still works. Jenkins still hopeless. I am well. And that, truly, is all that needs to be said. Evening begins slowly in Madras. Not all at once. First, the light softens, turning golden and warm, like melted brass poured gently over the world. Then, the sounds shift, less shouting, more murmurs. Fewer birds, more insects. Corporal William Hensley wakes from his brief doze under the awning by the munitions shed. He stretches his arms overhead, joints cracking like the old timbers of a ship. The book slips from his lap. He picks it up carefully, brushes off a leaf, and folds the corner of a page he will likely reread for the 3rd time tomorrow. Drill time. At 1,700 hours sharp, the sergeant's whistle cuts through the humid air. Like a conductor summoning a worn-out orchestra, it draws the men into motion once more. Some groan. Some move with military cheer. William, as ever, just rises and goes. On the parade ground, they form ranks. 30 men, boots aligned, rifles gleaming, somehow. The humidity should have dulled the metal, but discipline always wins. The drill today is bayonet practice. Form. Advance. Lunge. Withdraw. Over and over. William doesn't think about it much. His body knows what to do. He focuses instead on the young man to his left, Private Ellis, barely 18, from Manchester, with a permanent sunburn and a nervous twitch in his jaw. "Keep your elbows tight," William mutters during a pause. "You swing wide, you miss your mark." Ellis nods. "Yes, corporation." The routine is soothing in its own way. There's comfort in repetition. In muscle memory. In knowing that for 15 minutes, or 30, or 60, your mind can rest while your body simply does its job. They finish just as the sun slips behind the hills. Drill dismissed. The men break formation like waves collapsing on a quiet shore. Some head to the well to wash. Others to the mess. A few light cigarettes and lean against the wall, boots unbuckled, laughing too loud. William walks toward the barracks, boots crunching softly on gravel. He pauses by the flagpole. The Union Jack flutters gently in the evening breeze. It's frayed at the corners. Faded a little. But it's still there, unmoving, even in a land far from the isles that birthed it. He stands there a moment longer than usual, eyes tracing the fabric. He thinks of his father, also a soldier, lost in a skirmish in Africa when William was just 12. He thinks of his mother, who never remarried and who once told him, with a soft voice over a bowl of soup, "The world's bigger than Yorkshire, Will. But Yorkshire's still the bit you carry." And she was right. He does carry it. In his voice. In the way he folds his shirt. In the old song he hums when he polishes his rifle. Evening is settling now, fully. The sun is gone, the heat giving way to something gentler. Crickets begin their concert. A lantern flickers to life at the mess door. It's nearly time for dinner. But before he joins the others, William leans back against a stone wall, exhales slowly, and watches the stars begin to wake up one by one. Out here, under this sky, with this life, the world feels far and very near all at once. Dinner is not glamorous, but it is familiar. The mess hall is little more than a timber structure with long benches, dim lamps hanging from hooks, and a chalkboard that proudly announces boiled mutton, potatoes, and bread, probably. Corporal William Hensley walks in, slides onto a bench at the end of a row, and removes his cap. The air inside is warm and thick with smells, stewed meat, sweat, and the faintest trace of pipe smoke from the officer's table. He nods at the men across from him. There's Jenkins, the young one who always talks with his mouth full. And Evans, who can play the fiddle like no one else in the regiment. And Barrett, quiet, thoughtful, always carrying a worn book of poetry in his tunic pocket. They eat, not in silence, but not loudly either. There's a kind of reverence to this time of day. A softness. Like everyone knows they've made it through another round of heat, drills, and hours that stretch long across the world. Jenkins tries to tell a joke. It's not a good one. But everyone laughs because it's easier that way. Even William smiles, shaking his head slightly, chewing his bread with steady calm. After dinner, the men scatter. Some go to the barracks. Some linger by the fence, sharing stories in low tones. A few gather in a corner with cards, dealing with the same routine grace they use to clean their rifles. William takes a different route. He heads to the writing shed, a small room with a slanted desk, a tin of ink, and a pile of envelopes donated by a charity back home. He doesn't write every night, but tonight feels like a letter sort of night. He pulls out a sheet of paper, smooths it against the desk, dips his pen. The words come slowly, but clearly. Dear Mary. The heat here still wakes us up before the bugle. They say it'll get worse next month. Jenkins has taken to stuffing his cap with crushed mint leaves, says it keeps the sweat out of his eyes, but I think it just makes him smell like the market. I helped Ellis with his bayonet stance today. He reminds me of Thomas when he was younger. Nervous, but eager. That's the best kind, I think. The stars here are something else. Brighter than home. Wilder too. Like they don't belong to anyone. He pauses. Taps the pen against his chin. Then signs. Your brother always. Will. He seals the envelope with the care of a man who knows how far it must travel. From the coast, to the ship, across oceans and continents, then into the quiet hands of a sister in a stone cottage near the North Sea. The night is fully spread now. He steps outside, stretching his back, looking up at the inky sky. There are no street lamps out here. No carriages rumbling by. Just the soft chirping of night creatures and the occasional bark of a stray dog near the stables. As he walks back to the barracks, lanterns flicker like little hearths. Inside, the men are already peeling off boots, brushing dust from their beds, muttering prayers or cursing old aches. William sits on his cot, unbuttons his tunic, and pulls out the violet pressed between pages of a small field Bible. He doesn't read the verses tonight. He just holds the flower for a moment, closes the book, and lays back. Outside, the empire carries on, big, vast, and distant. But inside this small corner of it, one soldier listens to the slow breath of sleep beginning all around him, and lets himself drift gently into dreams. Night in the barracks comes in waves. The rustling of sheets. The low groans of sore bodies turning in narrow cots. The creak of wood expanding and shrinking in the shifting warmth. And then, stillness. Corporal William Hensley lies on his back, hands resting softly on his chest, breath deep and steady. There's no pillow, not really. Just a rolled uniform shirt that smells faintly of dust, tea, and metal oil. But it's enough. And slowly, gently, he begins to drift. Not into full sleep. Not yet. First, there's that space in between, the quiet corridor where memories visit like old friends who never knock. It starts with a sound. The clink of a cup in a Yorkshire kitchen, long ago. His mother's humming, something wordless and sweet. The comfort of steam rising from a chipped ceramic mug. He was 9, maybe 10. His boots didn't fit, but he wore them anyway, just to be like his father. Then, the images change. He sees Egypt. The golden city of Cairo, where he once stood on guard outside a British consulate while locals swept the streets barefoot. He had never seen so much light in one place. Light on stone, light on robes, light in the eyes of children who ran laughing beside a camel-drawn cart. The dreams are soft-edged now. More sensation than story. He's marching again, somewhere in Africa. The dust coats his tongue. His uniform is tight, his boots too hot, and a letter from Mary rides in his chest pocket like a talisman. The drums beat slow. Steady. He doesn't know if it's real memory or just the rhythm of his own heart echoing through old recollections. Then, an image of Private Dawes. Young. Smiling. Missing a tooth. The man who once carved a chess set out of scrap wood during a 5-week stationing in Burma. Dawes who never came back from that patrol near Rangoon. The dream doesn't replay the moment. Just the absence. The echo. A chair left pulled out at the mess table. William shifts slightly in his cot. A breeze stirs the netting above him. He murmurs something, not in words, but in tone. It sounds like an apology. He dreams of water next. Standing waist-deep in the Arabian Sea, trousers rolled to his knees, laughing with Barrett and Jenkins, who argued about whether jellyfish could sneak into boots. And the laughter, his own laughter, sounds so unfamiliar now. It's rare, but honest. The kind of joy that catches you by surprise, even after war. Another turn in the cot. A creak. Someone snores softly 2 bunks down. William dreams of a woman he met only once. At a garden party in Bombay. She was wearing a green scarf. Her laugh had made him forget the heat for just a moment. They spoke only briefly. He doesn't remember her name. But in dreams, names don't matter, only how you felt when they looked your way. Back in the real world, the barracks are calm. A lantern still burns low by the door. Its glow flickers like a heartbeat across the far wall. And William sleeps. Dreaming not of glory. Not of parades. But of faces. Moments. Smells. The weight of a letter in his hand. The brush of a leaf against his arm on a jungle march. The taste of tea after days without. You see, soldiers don't dream of war. They dream of peace they've borrowed. Of home they've carried in their boots. Of simple things, like a dry pair of socks, or a song someone hummed while peeling potatoes. And tonight, William Hensley is no different. Just a man. Asleep in a place not his own. With a sky full of unfamiliar stars. And the memory of violets folded between the pages of a book he hasn't opened in weeks. The bugle doesn't always sound like a trumpet of glory. Sometimes, it's just a reminder. A suggestion from the rising sun that the world has turned again, and your place in it is waiting. Corporal William Hensley opens his eyes before it even plays. Years of service will do that. Your body learns the time even when your mind still lingers somewhere in a dream about home, or rain, or scones the way your aunt used to make them, heavy, sweet, and warm. He stretches before he sits up. One leg at a time over the side of the cot, toes finding the familiar chill of the morning stone floor. The air is cooler than it will be in a few hours. There's even a trace of dew clinging to the air, rare and fleeting in Madras. He washes his face with water from a tin basin, just a splash. The cold wakes him completely. Then he wipes his hands on a threadbare towel and sets about the quiet art of dressing. Boots. Trousers. Tunic. Belt. All in their place. It's not about pride, not exactly. It's about rhythm. Each piece where it belongs, every morning. A kind of daily contract between the man and the duty. Outside, the camp is just beginning to stir. Cooks light fires beneath blackened kettles. Younger soldiers shuffle about, bleary-eyed, fumbling for canteens or combs. A rooster crows, not army-issued, but a regular guest near the mess tent who struts like he outranks everyone. William walks slowly toward the edge of the garrison yard, his boots crunching gently on gravel. He likes this time. Before the shouts. Before the drills. Before the orders barked and the papers signed. This hour belongs to the quiet. He watches a group of local women walking along the road beyond the fence, balancing baskets of fruit and herbs on their heads with graceful ease. He nods politely as they pass, and one of them waves, familiar now after weeks of morning glances. He thinks, briefly, of writing a poem. Not that he considers himself a poet. But sometimes there's a line that writes itself in the head of a man who's too tired to be clever and too far from home to say what he means plainly. The world is wide. And my boots are worn. But still, I walk. He smiles to himself at the thought. Maybe he'll jot it down later. Maybe not. Some things are just meant to be held, not written. Back at the mess, there's tea, always. Dark and earthy, no milk today. William takes a tin cup and finds a step to sit on. Private Ellis walks by and salutes too early, his hand awkward. William gives a nod in return. You'll get the timing right eventually. Ellis grins, his teeth stained from tea. Morning, corporation. Morning. The warmth of the cup seeps into William's fingers. Another day has begun. Another sunrise over a land not his own. But it's all right. The dust, the drill, the language barriers, the letters delayed by weeks, it's all part of the life. He's a soldier. Not for glory anymore. Not even just for Queen and country. But for the men beside him. For the memory of his father. For the quiet peace found in structure, in repetition, in knowing exactly what to do and when to do it. And as the sun rises fully over the red clay rooftops, he stands, places the cup on the step, adjusts his belt, and begins the walk back toward the parade ground. Another day. Another line in a long, steady march that began years ago, and will continue until it doesn't. Late morning is often the quietest hour in a soldier's day. The drills are done. The meals have settled. The officers retreat indoors for reports and correspondence. Even the heat seems to pause, for just a moment, before beginning its long, steady descent into afternoon heaviness. Corporal William Hensley finds a patch of shade beneath the banyan tree near the southern fence. It's the one with roots that drop like curtains and ants that march with military discipline across the bark. He sits cross-legged in the dirt, polishing his boots not because they need it, but because it calms the hands. And because, out here, small rituals are anchors in an ocean of unfamiliarity. From here, he can see beyond the garrison wall, into the village. Children laugh as they chase a stray goat through a lane of sun-baked homes. Women bend gracefully at wells, their bangles jingling like soft wind chimes. A man sharpens a knife on a stone, occasionally pausing to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. It is so ordinary. And so different. Sometimes, William wonders how the empire holds together. How the crown in London extends over forests in Burma, deserts in Africa, mountains in Afghanistan, and plains like these, everywhere and nowhere all at once. He knows the narrative they're given: civilization, duty, order. But when he sees the children laugh or the fruit seller haggle or the priest sweep the temple steps, he realizes they already have order. They already have rhythm. And the empire is something laid on top of all that. A heavy hand atop a well-written page. He doesn't dwell on it long. Philosophy is better suited to officers or clergymen. Still, the thought lingers like a fine dust on his sleeve. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small carving, roughly whittled from mango wood. It's a gift from the boy who helped sweep the officers' quarters. A tiny elephant, no longer than his thumb. No name, no words. Just given. And now it travels in William's pocket wherever he goes. A small thing. But small things matter. He recalls a market near Pretoria where he once bought an orange from a woman with the clearest green eyes he'd ever seen. She had overcharged him. He knew it. She knew it. But she'd winked, and he'd laughed, and they both walked away with something more valuable than the coin that passed between them. Back at camp, Private Jenkins is being scolded, again, for misplacing his bayonet sheath. William watches from a distance, then calls out, "Check your cot leg. You tucked it there yesterday." A pause. Jenkins lifts the blanket. Sheath recovered, Corp, he shouts, triumphant and sheepish all at once. William just nods, hiding a small smile. There's no reward in remembering another man's mess. But it keeps the peace. And peace, in a place like this, is earned in teaspoons, not barrels. He finishes the boots. They shine dully in the sun, more dust than leather now, but respectable enough. He taps them together, stands, and stretches his arms overhead until his back cracks gently. The bell will ring soon. Not for lunch, not yet. But for the midday mail. Letters are rare but precious. Sometimes weeks old. Sometimes missing entirely. But when they arrive, they carry the weight of whole oceans. And though William tells himself not to expect one, he always listens a little closer when his name is read aloud. The bell rings. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a single clang from the mess pole near the quartermaster's tent. It's the sound every man perks up to hear. Mail has arrived. There is no ceremony. Just a canvas satchel slung off the side of a mule cart, handed off to a clerk with sweat staining the back of his uniform. The soldiers gather loosely around the open crate. Not in ranks, but in hope. Corporal William Hensley stands at the edge. He pretends to not care. Pretends he came for the shade, or to speak to the quartermaster. But he listens. Names are read aloud, each one followed by a shuffle, a nod, or a small cry of joy. Then, Corporal W. E. Hensley. Simple. No embellishment. No fanfare. But William feels a stillness settle inside him. He steps forward, accepts the envelope. It's a bit smudged. The ink on the address faded slightly by heat and time. But it is unmistakably her handwriting. Mary. His sister's script always leans slightly right, as though eager to move forward even as the rest of the world slows down. He doesn't open it there. Not in front of the others. Instead, he walks to a quiet spot near the water barrels, where the camp's edge meets a thin fence woven with vines. He sits on an overturned crate. Breathes in. Then opens the envelope with care, folding back the flap as though it contained something fragile. The letter begins simply. Dear Will, I hope this reaches you before Christmas. If not, Happy New Year. Or Easter. Or something. He smiles. Things here are just the same. Mrs. Dalton's hens got loose again. Thomas still sings in the bath, and Mum says she'll throw his boots in the sea if he doesn't stop leaving them at the door like a lord. We miss you. The village is quiet without your whistle. The garden's doing better. The violets came up early this year. Violets! William places the letter in his lap and carefully opens his Bible. There, still pressed flat between the pages, is the one violet he brought with him. Dry now. Delicate. But whole. He resumes reading. Do you remember that game we used to play with the biscuit tin? When we'd pretend it was a treasure chest, and the old spoon was a royal scepter. I found that tin in the attic. Still has your initials scratched into the bottom. I think of you when the wind blows through the garden gate. I hope the wind finds you too, wherever you are. He finishes the letter slowly. Reads it again. Then folds it back along its original creases and returns it to the envelope. He doesn't cry. Not quite. But he does sit there longer than he meant to. Listening to the wind. Wondering if it might just be the same wind she spoke of, somehow traveling across continents, through trees and valleys and foreign streets, to reach him. This is what the Empire rarely records. Not the battles. Not the borders. But the quiet exchange of tenderness between brother and sister, soldier and civilian, life and memory. He stands. Tucks the envelope carefully into his inner pocket. And walks back toward the barracks, heart lighter, chest warmer, shoulders still square but somehow softer. The afternoon settles with a softness that belies the heat. The sky above Madras is streaked with pale clouds, the kind that promise neither shade nor rain, just a distant reminder that the heavens are still turning. Corporal William Hensley stands by the well, filling his canteen slowly. The handle creaks as it turns, the rope spools back up with a lazy rhythm. The water is warm. Everything is. He tips the canteen to his lips, takes a measured sip, then dabs a few drops across the back of his neck. He breathes in deeply through his nose. This place, the smells of it, the sound of carts on dirt roads, the call to prayer in the distance, the soft rustle of banyan leaves in the courtyard. It's all so vivid now. But he knows. In time, it will blur. Like Cairo. Like Rangoon. Like home. He watches as Private Barrett walks by with a new recruit, barely 16 by the look of him, with fresh boots and a uniform that still creases like it's never been sweated through. Barrett gives a half wave. You good, Corp? William nods. I'm always good. You know that. Barrett grins. Only man in the Empire with boots older than his spine. They both chuckle, a low, easy sound. The kind of laugh that needs no effort. When Barrett and the boy are gone, William walks toward the flagpole. The Union Jack flutters softly. Not stiff. Not proud. Just present. As always. He looks at it, tilts his head slightly. He's saluted this flag 1,000 times. Marched beneath it in sun, in rain, in fog so thick he once lost sight of the man in front of him. He has carried it in parades, guarded it in barracks, seen it raised over cities that had never heard of Britain before a gunboat arrived at their harbour. And he's asked himself, quietly, always quietly, what it really means. Not what it's supposed to mean. But what it does mean. To him. It means home, yes. And order. And tradition. But it also means loss. It means the boy from Norfolk who didn't return from Sudan. It means villages where silence follows every step. It means orders followed because there is no room for disobedience when you wear the uniform. He doesn't regret it. He wouldn't say that. But he feels the weight of it now more than he used to. He thinks of the people he's met, some friendly, some wary, some distant. He remembers a local teacher who once shared a bowl of rice with him under a mango tree and asked, "When you go home, will you speak of us? Or only of the dust and the heat?" William hadn't answered then. He didn't have one. He's not sure he does now. But he knows this. He's seen more kindness than he expected. More quiet rebellion, too. Not in battles, but in the way a woman continues to wear her wedding sari even after the garrison bans local dyes. In the way a child draws a map that doesn't include London. And he doesn't feel anger in that. Just understanding. The empire, in its grandeur, often forgets the faces on the ground. But William remembers. He always will. And maybe that's what service is, in the end. Not waving the flag. Not fighting the wars. But remembering. And carrying the weight of those memories honestly. He salutes the flag, just once. Not stiffly. Not for show. But because he still believes in duty, even if he no longer believes every word printed in the dispatches from Westminster. Then he turns away, walking slowly back toward the barracks, where the men are gathering for evening rations and the usual grumbles about stew. The world turns. The empire holds. And one soldier, far from home, walks the edge of loyalty with eyes wide open. Evening comes slowly in the tropics. The sky deepens from gold to rust, then to a velvet purple that seems to drip down the sides of buildings and trees like paint that refuses to dry. The courtyard cools just enough for breath to feel lighter in the chest. Not quite comfortable, but no longer punishing. Corporal William Hensley sits with his back against the barracks wall, a tin plate in his lap. Stew again. Possibly with mutton. Possibly with hope. It's hard to tell, and he's long stopped asking. Across from him, Barrett is retelling a story for the 5th time, about the night a monkey made off with the captain's pipe during a posting in Singapore. He chased it for 10 minutes with nothing but a boot in hand and righteous fury in his eyes, Barrett says, spoon waving in the air. Swore the thing winked at him. The monkey, not the captain. The others laugh, not because it's new, but because it's familiar. And after long days filled with sameness and sweat, familiarity is its own kind of feast. Private Jenkins tunes a fiddle in the corner. It's missing a string, but he plays anyway. Something slow. Irish, maybe. The kind of song that doesn't need lyrics to sink into your chest. As the melody drifts into the night air, William feels the weight of silence settle between them all. Not uncomfortable. Not empty. Just shared. The kind of silence men only earn after months together. Where every creak of a boot and shift in breath says what words cannot. He looks around and realizes how many of them are young. So young. Ellis, not yet old enough to shave, sits beside Jenkins, humming softly and tapping his fingers against his knee. Barrett, older, steady, eyes half closed as if seeing the song rather than hearing it. And William himself, somewhere in the middle. Not a boy. Not quite old. But older than he meant to be. He thinks of his father again. Of stories once told in firelight, the scent of coal smoke thick in his childhood nostrils. Back then, he thought war was glory. That a red coat made you more than just a man. Now, he knows better. It doesn't make you more. It just makes you invisible. To bullets. To orders. To time. He finishes his stew. Sets the plate aside. Leans back, letting the wall support the ache in his shoulders. The fiddle continues. Someone begins to sing, not loud, not sharp, just a low hum that becomes a verse. Then a chorus. Others join in. When the wind blows cold on London town, I'll think of sun and foreign ground. The voices blend, off-key but sincere. A tapestry of accents, Yorkshire, Dublin, Glasgow, Portsmouth. Each note a thread. William doesn't sing. But he hums. And somewhere deep in his chest, the rhythm finds its place. He thinks of the letter again. Mary. The violets. The old biscuit tin buried in attic dust. And he feels a strange peace. Not joy. Not sadness. Just the quiet comfort of knowing that, even in the Empire's farthest reach, among men whose lives might be forgotten by history books, there is music. And memory. And the strange, beautiful persistence of hope. The song fades. Boots are unlaced. Plates stacked. The lamps dim. And another day, one of thousands, draws its final breath in the heart of an empire. The camp is nearly asleep. Only the low hiss of the oil lamp by the barracks door, the creak of canvas in the breeze, and the quiet shifting of limbs in sleep break the silence. Corporal William Hensley sits awake. Not from unrest. Just habit. Years in service have taught him that the night is the best time for thinking. No orders to follow. No boots to polish. Just a man and his thoughts, like old friends on a bench. He pulls out his pocket watch. The glass is cracked, but the hands still move, faithful as always. It was a gift from a man long dead, in a place William no longer remembers the name of. They had traded rations during a storm. The man had slipped the watch into William's hand and said, "You'll outlast me. Take it." And he had. Outlasted many. Sometimes William wonders why. He wasn't the fastest. Not the bravest. He wasn't the kind of soldier bards sing about in taverns. But he was steady. He followed orders. Tied the knots. Shared the rations. Carried the heavy packs when younger legs gave out. He was the kind of man empires are quietly built on. Not celebrated, but remembered by the few who stood beside him. He looks around the sleeping room, rows of cots, blankets rising and falling with the breath of men not yet 20. So many have their whole lives ahead of them. And yet, William knows, not all of them will make it home. Some will fall to disease. Some to miscalculated orders. Some to the chaos no soldier can predict. And for those who do return, home will feel both sweeter and stranger. He remembers coming home once, briefly, after the Sudan campaign. His mother had baked a pie. The village children had stared at his uniform like he was a hero from a book. And yet, he felt out of place. The walls were too close. The streets too narrow. The sky, somehow smaller. It wasn't until he heard the cry of a crow and felt the weight of his old kit bag that he breathed properly again. The Empire doesn't just send men to fight. It reshapes them. You return, changed. Not better. Not worse. Just different. And yet, William feels no bitterness. There is a dignity in service. Even if the world forgets your name. He reaches for his writing tin. It's small, scratched and dented. Inside, a folded sheet of paper, a stub of a pencil, and his sister's last letter. He begins to write. Dear Mary. The violets are still pressed between page 12 and 13. They've kept their shape. Today was hot, as always. We had stew again. Barrett told that monkey story, you'd laugh, still. I've been thinking a lot about time. Not in a gloomy way, just in that way one does when the sky gets especially wide and the silence settles in just right. I wonder what will be remembered. If anything. I hope, if nothing else, someone remembers that we tried to be kind. Even in places where kindness didn't always make sense. He stops. Not because he's finished. But because the words are enough for now. He folds the letter, tucks it inside the tin. The lantern flickers. The night deepens. And William lies down, hands behind his head, staring at a ceiling painted in shadow. He thinks of rivers. Of train whistles. Of children playing cricket with sticks in the dust. He thinks of peace, not as an end to war, but as the quiet between heartbeats. And finally, sleep comes. Before the light, there is always that hush. Not silence, never silence. But a hush. The kind of stillness that feels almost sacred. A rooster cries in the distance. Not the one from the mess tent, and another, deeper voiced and more indignant. The sky is not yet pink, but the edge of it carries a softer breath. Corporal William Hensley opens his eyes. He did not hear the bugle. He did not need to. His body knows the rhythm. The cots around him are still full. Private Ellis has one arm hanging off the side like a child reaching for a toy in a dream. Barrett is snoring, lightly now, more wheeze than rumble. William sits up slowly. His back gives its usual complaint. His knees pop softly in reply. He washes again, just as he always does. Dresses with deliberate ease, belt looped, buttons checked, boots laced. But today, he takes an extra moment. He retrieves the letter tin. Not to write. Just to hold. Then he slips the watch into his pocket. Adjusts his collar. And walks. The morning is as familiar as the feel of his own hands. Smoke curls from the cook fire. The local women pass by again, baskets lighter this time. One of them waves. He returns the gesture, just as before. And yet, today feels different. Not dramatically. Not like a chapter closing. More like a page turning without sound. He walks beyond the barracks, past the edge of the drill field. To the banyan tree. Its roots hang lower this morning. Or perhaps he stands a bit taller. He rests one hand on the bark. Feels the coolness of it. The age. The stillness. And for a moment, he allows himself to imagine the tree outlasting everything, the camp, the empire, even memory. He thinks of Mary again. Of violets. Of the garden gate. Of home. And he knows, deep in the softest part of his chest, that he will not be remembered in textbooks. No statue will bear his name. No poem will recite his deeds. But somewhere, a boy will carry a wooden elephant carved by a friend. A girl will read a letter kept safe in a drawer. A song will be sung beside another fire, in another time. And the shape of his life will echo in footsteps not yet taken. He is a soldier. But more than that. He is a man who lived with steadiness. With care. With quiet courage. The sun crests the horizon. Warm, golden light spills across the stones. Dust dances in it, briefly immortal. William Hensley turns back toward the camp. Another day begins. And with it, the soft, unspoken promise that even the smallest lives carry weight, when lived with dignity.